This is the Fairbairn Sykes Commando dagger, made famous during World War II and used ever since. But there are some myths about it that I've noticed over the last few months. So here we're going to look at 6 myths about the Fairbairn Sykes dagger. Hi folks, I'm Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatoria in Easton Antique Arms, and the first thing I want to mention is I am not an expert on Fairbairn Sykes daggers, but I'm trying to learn as much as I can. There are other experts out there in the world like Ivan Gansby or Paul MacDonald. Defer to them for greater wisdom than me. However, over the last few months I've started to make videos talking about World War I and World War II fighting knives and their use thereof. And I've noticed a few myths being repeated by people in comments, some of which I'm aware are wrong or at least slightly wrong. So here I'm going to try and set out to correct 6 myths about the Fairbairn Sykes Commando dagger. Now, very appropriately to this video, I've actually just been listening to a couple of podcasts by Dan Snow and guests on History Hit, and History Hit are the very kind sponsors of this video. And they've put together a fantastic offer just for viewers of this channel, which would be great for yourself or indeed as a gift over the festive period. Now, it should be pretty obvious that I'm obsessed with history. I make tons of videos about history and I've studied it right the way through to degree level. And if you're at all like me and you're obsessed with history, then History Hit is pretty much made for you. If you imagine collecting up all of those history documentaries you love and putting them into one place, well, that's History Hit. History Hit covers absolutely all periods and covers some of the stories that have shaped the world through their award-winning podcast and their online history channel. Basically, if you imagine Netflix, but it's all history. And it's got hundreds of hours of content to get through. One of the fantastic things about History Hit is you can access it absolutely anywhere, on your phone, on your tablet, on your TV, on your PC. So you can listen to it while you're driving in the car, or you can be waiting in a car park, or sitting in the comfort of your own home. And it has leading historians and experts, people like Dan Snow himself, Professor Susanna Lipscomb, or Dan Jones, for example. And in addition to all of the programs already on there, they add 2 more every week. And every week they add 19 new episodes across 8 different podcasts, including the world's leading history podcast, which is Dan Snow's History Hit. So I've recently been watching D-Day as it happened, and this is part of the D-Day 75 series of videos, 13 videos in an absolutely awesome series presented by Dan Snow. There's various other people involved in the series as well. It talks about the paratroopers and how they had to be dropped to secure certain bridges to prevent the SS Panzer divisions from coming and reinforcing the German positions, and therefore that would have made the D-Day landings a lot more complicated. So Commandos yet again being incredibly important to the war effort. So how do you get access? Well, I've got a very special offer just for viewers of this channel, and it's an unrivaled offer as far as I've seen, and it's 60% off for the first 6 months. That means you're paying less than £3 per month for full access to History Hit, and you use the discount code History Hit. So if you click that link below, you can access for 60% off for your first 6 months, less than £3 a month, which I think is an absolutely fantastic offer. And remember, this could be great for you, or it could be great as a gift over Christmas. So check out History Hit right now with that link below and that code on screen. And I hope you enjoy it, and thanks a lot to History Hit for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the main topic here, which is these myths, the 6 myths that I've defined anyway, based on my observations of the last few months of making videos about them, related to the Fairbairn Sykes Commando dagger. Now, first thing to mention for those of you who don't know, so experts will know all of these things, but those of you who have a casual interest or don't necessarily know very much about these at all, these are a type of commando dagger that was devised relatively early on in the Second World War, based on the Shanghai Municipal Police daggers that were developed by Fairbairn and Sykes and other people probably as well. And they were also the first ones, the first pattern were created by Wilkinson Sword in conjunction with Fairbairn and Sykes. And they are primarily a thrusting dagger. We'll talk more about that in a second. And this is a 3rd pattern. So this is a late Second World War original example. I've got the scabbard here. They come in essentially 3 patterns. There's 1st pattern, 2nd pattern, 3rd pattern. And we'll look at the differences between these in future videos. That's not what we're talking about here. But just so you know, there are some variations, and the 1st pattern looks somewhat different to the 3rd pattern. So myth number 1 is the people who say that's not a knife, that's a dagger. I often refer to this as a fighting knife, and people have said, Matt, that's not a knife, that's a dagger. Well, let's be strict about this. A dagger is a type of knife, okay? So a dagger is subset of the greater umbrella group of knife. Moreover, the first pattern and sometimes the second pattern have etched on the base of the blade, especially when it's a Wilkinson example, pretty much usually when it's a Wilkinson example, but even sometimes when it's not a Wilkinson example, it says the FS fighting knife. So even on the earliest ones that were, you know, stamp of approval, made under the eyes of Fairbairn and Sykes themselves and made by Wilkinson Sword, were referred to as fighting knives. So yes, it's a dagger. Yes, it's a knife. A dagger is a type of knife, and these were referred to in period as fighting knives. So the next myth relates to shininess. Now this is a modern replica, Sheffield made replica of a second pattern, and you'll notice it has a shiny blade and a blackened hilt. The modern replicas tend to have steel hilts that are blackened. The original ones are actually blackened brass, but anyway, that's another topic for another video. And lots of people, when I showed this, said, Matt, why is your blade shiny? The Commando dagger should have a black blade. Well, no, that's the second myth. Commando daggers absolutely are not always blackened fully. In fact, the earliest, the first pattern Commando daggers usually feature a shiny blade and a brass with nickel plated, so silver appearance underneath its brass, on top its nickel plate. So a silver coloured grip and guard and a silver coloured blade. Later on, they started to blacken the hilts, and it became quite common on second patterns to have, like exactly like here, have a shiny blade and a blackened hilt. And then also it started to become popular fairly quickly on to blacken the blades as well. And gradually, by the end of the war, the majority were fully blackened. However, throughout the entire war, at the beginning, most of them were entirely shiny. At the end, most of them were entirely black. However, throughout the entirety of the war, you could find examples which had either a shiny blade or a shiny hilt, or both, and sometimes a bright brass hilt, and all sorts of other variations. So absolutely, the Commando dagger was not always blackened. It was sometimes shiny, even when used on active service. And in addition to that, Fairbairn even mentions the shininess of these blades being somewhat intimidating to an opponent. So absolutely, at that point, it was considered that blades were going to be shiny. The blackened blade, it was kind of an afterthought. The third urban myth is that these were not supposed to be sharp-edged and that they were only supposed to be pointy because they are stabbing implements. This isn't really correct for a number of reasons. First of all, these replicas, so when I did a review of this replica, I complained the fact that it is not at all sharp, despite the fact that I paid for it to be sharpened, and it wasn't. If I take this genuine one from World War II, I'm not going to run this up and down my finger because it might cut my finger. Now, it's not super sharp. This is obviously fairly old. It dates to World War II, but nevertheless, it has a single bevel edge that comes down to a very fine edge, and in practice, these were supposed to be sharpened. Now, where a second level of confusion lies is a lot of these were never actually issued, never carried, never used. So these were made in vast quantities in World War II, so much so that huge numbers of surplus were actually sent to America after the war and stamped with the word England because of export rules. And they were sold in army surplus stores and all kinds of stuff, and used by, you know, basically collected by kids as souvenirs or occasionally used as tools. So the fact is that lots of these old Commando daggers in circulation were never issued, never used, and therefore never sharpened. However, on active service, these were supposed to be kept sharp. As evidence of that, we have Fairbairn's own writings and also descriptive accounts of the use of these in combat, but also we have even video of Fairbairn showing how these were used. And the fact is that if you look at Fairbairn's own manuals for how you're supposed to use one of these, then the edge is important. The edge is used for numerous things. It's used for cutting arteries, it's also used for assisting the stab, and it's used for slashing as well. Which brings us neatly into the fourth urban myth about Commando daggers, and that is that they are only stabbing implements. This is incorrect if we look at Fairbairn's own writings. Yes, clearly they are specialised to stabbing and they are designed primarily as stabbing daggers. However, the edges were intended to be used in a number of ways, and most people, I think, would concede that they are being used against major arteries in a kind of assassination or killing silently mode. But in addition, when used as a combat knife, and they were also intended to be used in the hand as combat knives face to face against opponents, because Fairbairn explicitly shows this in his interviews and videos that have thankfully survived and been recorded and passed down to us, and you can find these on YouTube if you just search for Fairbairn. And he does indeed slash and chop with it as well. Okay, it absolutely was used as a slashing implement and could give a push cut, a draw cut, and the edges assist the thrust as mentioned. So this is primarily a stabbing implement, but very much the cut was supposed to be employed with these as well in a variety of different ways. Right, the fifth urban myth I see said about these Commando daggers is that they are never ever supposed to be held in an ice pick grip, that they are always supposed to be held, as Fairbairn describes, between the index finger and the thumb. He sometimes describes this as a foil grip in this manner. Well, indeed, this is predominantly how they are held. However, if we go back to the source material, we look at the Commando training material, and indeed if we look at the videos and photographs of the time of people training actually in Commandos being trained, but additionally descriptive accounts of people afterwards describing how they use these things, particularly for killing sentries silent and this kind of stuff, absolutely we also find references to them being held point down. And in fact, Fairbairn is shown himself doing it this way around in some cases. Now, that's not to say it's necessarily optimal, it's not to say it's preferred, it is predominantly held with the point up, but in some circumstances, from certain angles for certain purposes, absolutely these were used in an ice pick sometimes. So yes, I think it's true to say not predominantly held in an ice pick grip, but to say they were never held in an ice pick grip, I think we can say is categorically wrong, because they certainly were. And remember that even no matter what you teach people, sometimes they will just do something anyway. But we know from the training material and recorded material and written material that sometimes they absolutely were used this way around, even if the priority and the preference most of the time in most circumstances is to hold them this way around. So the final myth that I have seen commonly spouted about the Fairbairn Sykes Commando dagger is that it is only an assassin's weapon to be used in stealthy attacks. And I oppose this notion on a number of points. It is very well suited to be used as a weapon in silent killing and stealth attacks. Absolutely. I'm not saying it is bad at that. What I am saying is that it was also intended to be used as a general purpose fighting knife, and it was done. And one of the points I've made in one of my other videos, which I think a lot of people who have a little bit of knowledge about these are not necessarily aware of, is these weren't only given to commandos, these weren't only carried by commandos. You could either be issued with these or you could purchase these. And the fact is, in the Second World War, there were large numbers of people, including even the Home Guard in the UK, who got their hands on these things and were carrying these. So yes, you can creep up behind someone and stab them with it, and it's a very effective weapon for that. But they could also be used because they are, you know, they're not that small. It's a 7-inch blade or slightly under 7-inch blade, and it's a fairly sturdy knife, and it will punch through all sorts of protective clothing, or should we say layers of clothing, even winter clothing, fairly easily. And the fact is that if this is secreted somewhere on your body and it's relatively quick and easy to access, and I would argue quicker and easier to access than a typical bayonet that's on your belt, or a typical kukri or something on machete, something like this, the other things that might be carried at this time. This is quicker to deploy, easier to carry, and lighter and this kind of stuff, less likely to get in the way. This pulled out in a grappling situation because someone's charged at you because their submachine gun or revolver or whatever has run out of rounds, and so they've jumped on top of you and started grappling you and picked up a brick to try and break your head. If you pull this out of your webbing and jam this into their guts or their throat, then at that point, this is no longer a weapon of silent, stealthy killing. This is just a last-ditch shank. And they were very often deployed and expected to be used in that context. So they were essentially an all-round fighting knife. Yes, absolutely, you could use them for silent killing, but they weren't only intended to be used for that. And moreover, I would give as a piece of evidence for the fact that this basic dagger design is perfectly fine as an all-purpose trench knife, for example. If we look at World War I trench knives, there are a lot of World War I trench knives. There are Belgian ones, Austrian ones, German, British, Italian ones that fundamentally are not very different to the Fairbairn Sykes dagger. They're roughly the same size, they're basically point-centric, double-edged. So yeah, even in the trenches of World War I, when they were doing night raids and trench raiding and throwing grenades around and going in with bayonet point, this type of knife was still seen as a very valid in-your-hand fighting knife. It's not only an assassin's weapon, it's not only a stealth weapon. So I hope that has been interesting. Were you surprised by any of these myths? I hope not, but you never know. I do see a lot of rubbish being written about weapons that fundamentally we have to remember are part of propaganda and patriotism of the time. So things like the Kukri, the Fairbairn Sykes. There are certain weapons, it's like, if we talk about aeroplanes, it's like the Spitfire or the Mustang. There are certain weapons from history which it's difficult to entangle propaganda and mythology away from the facts. And you get a lot of passed down knowledge said in the school playground that you keep to your adult life and believe is true. Turns out it's not. And I'm always about trying to challenge and correct these myths. So, have you heard any other myths? I've heard certain ones about throwing kukris, we could look at maybe in a future video. But have you heard any other kind of urban myths about the Fairbairn Sykes dagger, or things that you've heard people saying about them that are categorically incorrect, or there's good evidence to show that that's not the case? Or, you know, do you think there's things I missed here? Do you think that some of the things I've said here were wrong? I'm equally happy to hear about those. If something I have said is wrong, then I'm always happy to be corrected and re-educated as well. I hope this has been entertaining and interesting. Thanks a lot again to the sponsors for this video. They make a big difference to this channel, and so do you. And you can help me by clicking that thumbs up like button, subscribing if you haven't done already, and sharing this video around. I hope to see you again soon, back on the channel. I have been Matt Easton, and I will still be next time. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.